Hi guys. So in today's video, we're gonna talk about ransomware protection, and we're gonna talk about impact reduction when a ransomware is acting on your system. So this video might be longer than the usual because there's a lot to talk about. So we're still in the field of risks. Okay, so in the last video we talked about likelihood reduction, and now it's going to be impact reduction. So what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about risk treatment, threat protection, risk impact reduction, administrative controls, and technical controls. So for the risk treatment, so we're going to talk about technical security controls and administrative security controls in order to mitigate the risk. And for the access control categories, which are going to help us to reduce the impact, we're going to talk about protection, detection, response, and recovery. So what is threat protection? So it's all about reducing the impact of a risk by implementing administrative, physical, and technical controls in order to reduce the consequences when the vulnerability is exploited and the system compromised. So now your system is compromised, and how are you going to control and limit the damage on your systems? So for the risk impact reduction, so to limit the impact of a ransomware, for example, you will need some administrative controls like a response plan, for example. So a response plan, it's going to allow you to know how to handle the incident, the situation, in order to limit the damage and reduce recovery efforts. So you're gonna have to prepare the response plan, prepare all the policies, the contacts that you're gonna have to call whenever an incident is coming, and which team members you need to gather. So maybe you have to call the CEO, for example. You have to contact also some engineers, some system security engineers, network engineers, and everything. And you've got to talk about the incident and take some steps, for example. So you also have to identify if the event you are seeing now, if it is really an incident, and if you need to, to start this process of response plan. You also have to contain the incident to limit the impact. So for example, you've got a workstation which has a ransomware. How are you going to limit the impact on your infrastructure? So on the other PCs, some servers, and the NAS, for example. Then you've got to eradicate the source of the problem. So you know that this machine is the problem. So you're gonna maybe, you're gonna put it aside, and you're going to clean the device or to reinstall the device, for example. Then you have to recover from the incident. Can I put the computer, or can I put the NAS back online? And of course, you've got to learn about everything that just happened. So for example, you know that this vulnerability has been exploited, so now you can, for example, put some measures to protect yourself from this vulnerability and to prevent that this event or incident might happen again. You can also learn maybe that the plan was not, for example, was not enough. You missed some things, and that you need to add them in the plans for next time. You will be more efficient. Now, some other things that are quite important is, for example, threat awareness for the users and for the IT staff. Okay, so you need to train the users and the IT staff. You need to train them to be able, so they can see or detect that something is going on. And if something is going on, what should they do? Should they just, do nothing and let the IT staff do all the work? Or maybe they should be, kind of proactive, for example, and directly contact some IT staff to limit the impact. Usually, users are the point of entry of problems, but they can also help you to reduce the impact if they are well trained and they know to differentiate between something that is not important and from something that is important. You can also define incident detection use cases that I will talk later, and you have to define backup and recovery plan and testing procedures. So, in order to limit the impact of the ransomware, for example, you will need some technical controls too. You will need to detect the attack, so you will have to technically apply the detection use cases that you have defined before. You're going to have to put in place some monitoring and some alerting. You can also implement technical controls to limit the impact and propagation of the ransomware. And you can try to use some automation or automated task in case of suspicious activity. So it will help you to contain the problem. You can also use some user behavior analysis to help see if it is a suspicious activity. This, of course, you might not really find this in the Synology. Usually it's a very complicated task because it needs to understand what the user is usually doing, and suddenly he's not doing it, but is it normal? Because maybe it's a one-time thing, or if it is a sign of an attack, for example. But when you're using automated tasks, depending on what you're going to do, it can lead to false positives. And depending on the answer that you are going to automate it, this can lead to DOS, to denial of service situation, unwanted DOS, of course. And you also have to regularly back up your data, test the backups, and test the recovery. Those three things are completely different, and usually we do the first thing, but we don't do the two latest thing. So for the administrative controls, now let's talk about threat awareness or user training. So users should be sensibilized to threats, and they need to be able to detect weird behaviors. Okay, so you need to teach them, for example, that usually your PC, it's in a certain state, and then suddenly if the person sees a lot of pop-ups, some red screen or blue screen, or I don't know what, maybe something strange is going on, and probably they should need to contact the IT staff so they can look at this. It's usually we often rely on the user seeing something strange, and then they're going to contact us. Some guidelines should be in place so they can take quick measures. So for example, they can be trained if something really, really weird is going on. They could probably turn off the PC, take out the network plug of their computer, and contact the IT staff. Those are just examples, of course. But the IT staff should also be trained to detect weird behaviors. So they should also have some guidelines that will help them to take the best actions depending on the threats. So this is a little bit, like a response plan actually. And you also need to define the priorities when you need to react. So for example, will you be more on the protection side or the investigation side? This is sometimes different because, for example, if you're going to tell your user, if you see something extremely weird, you turn off the computer, for example, you will protect your system, but you might lose some digital evidence, and you will not be able to completely understand what happened. If you are more on the investigation, maybe you can say that you just take the computer off the network, but you leave it on, and then you can try to understand the attack, see what's going on, and so you can probably better protect yourself next time. But this is more in the forensic world if you would like to preserve some digital evidence. But depending on the case, if you need to call the police, for example, for important case, you need to preserve digital evidence. Otherwise, they will not be able to do anything for you. Now, For the incident detection use cases, so basically it's just monitoring. So you need to know what kind of incident could happen to you and what you should look for in order to be able to detect them. So, for example, what kind of processes should you monitor on a NAS or on a personal computer, for example? What network flow should I pay attention on, or that should I monitor, for example? Like you are not using a protocol on your network and then suddenly you see your firewall that is allowing or blocking a lot of this type of traffic that you have never seen before, for example. Well, this is something that you should pay attention on. And of course, you have to be aware of new IOCs, so indicator of compromises. Those could be process, file names, hashes, web requests, protocols used, ports used, etc., etc. So those are the kind of things that you can monitor to see if something is strange. But for this, you also need to have some baselines. You need to know what kind of services or network flow you're going to have on your network. If you don't have this baseline, you cannot understand what is different than usual, so you cannot really know if something weird is going on and apply the correct reaction. You can also see what is the usual percentage of CPU used on your NAS, or the amount of RAM, the network throughput, and the usual services used. That's what I just said before. So for example, if you know that usually your CPU is at 10% and your RAM is 1 gigabyte and your network throughput is very low, for example, suddenly you are seeing that you have a lot of CPU. I forgot to mention the disk activity. Suddenly you have a lot of disk activity, which is not normal. Then you know that something weird is going on and that you should investigate. You also need to define thresholds so you can be alerted that you have gone over your baseline. Now, for the administrative controls, well, you have also backup and recovery. So you need to define backup plans um, to protect against physical and technical threats. So when I talk about physical threats, it can be someone stealing your NAS, it could be a flood, a fire, all of these kind of things, and of technical threats like ransomwares. So first of all, you need also to understand why you are going to backup. What are your recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives? So when we talk about RTO, it's how much time can your system be down before the business loss it's not tolerable anymore. And for the RPO is how many hours or days of data that you can lose before this loss is unacceptable. And all that is going to affect your backup strategy and of course the underlying cost of your backup strategy. You also need to define what are you going to backup, system configuration, maybe some specific data that should be backed up more often, for example. Where will you back it up? On-site, off-site, in the cloud? When will you back it up? Every hours, every 10 hours, every 2 days? How will you back it up? So what kind of backup strategy you're gonna take? So it's every time it's gonna be full, differential, incremental, and also on what medium you're gonna store it. So in the cloud, on a hard disk, on a tape. So with the Synology, you've got the hyper backup application, and you have usually, I think it's differential backups, and also you can put the backup on the cloud, and I think you can have multi-version. Well, that's the usual stuff that you're gonna do. You're gonna have multi-version backups or single version backup, but I think that single version is just a full backup. Of course, you have to create a backup testing and recovery testing procedures. A backup is nothing if you are not testing it and also testing the recovery. But this, I'm going to explain it in another slide. Of course, you can define local snapshots and snapshot replication strategies, as the NAS has the snapshot package, which is quite handy, especially against ransomware attacks. It will allow you to restore everything like in a minute if everything gets corrupted. Now, for the technical controls, we're going to talk about detection, monitoring, and alerting. So, first, how can you check for malicious activities before a ransomware attack? So those are just examples, but you can check for unusual network connections like firewalls, IPS, and web application firewall logs, where you can see that someone is trying to attack you for some days now, for example. So this person is really trying to get in your system. You can also have the unusual failed user authentication. So really someone is targeting a specific user, for example, or maybe it's just random users that the system is going to try to connect to compromise your system. And of course also unusual sources trying to connect. So for example, if you know that the CIO or the administrator is always logging from inside the network or from Switzerland, if you are going to see some connection from the United States with this username, from Russia, from China, from Portugal, I don't know what, so this is also something fishy. Now, okay, so someone has compromised the system, but how can you check that a ransomware attack is going on? So what should you look for? So as usual, you can look for unusual network connection, because depending on the case, you can have some lateral movements. So the ransomware is going to try to exploit some other vulnerabilities in other devices to attack and to exploit. So the firewall, you can see in the firewall logs that suddenly the NAS that usually never use this protocol or is never trying to connect to other devices, then suddenly it starts to try to connect. So this is a problem. Of course, you will have high CPU and disk activities. You could have a user accessing or modifying too many files. So for example, that this user usually, he opens like 20 files a day. Suddenly it's 500 files in 2 minutes. Then you know that a normal user cannot do that. So something is wrong. And if it's maybe modifying too many files, for example, the name is changing, the extension is changing, for example, and of course you will have a slow system. So you might find also some unusual process that are running on the computer or on the NAS, and you can have some as I said before, some file names and extensions that you have never seen before that suddenly start to appear. So now you have to implement the use cases that you have defined on paper before, where you're going to check for the process, the network activity, the CPU activity, etc. But you have to define a baseline first. If you don't know your system, you cannot know what to check. So you have to monitor the CPU, the RAM, and disk activity. You can create some alerts if the thresholds that you're going to put are reached. So you can use the performance alarm of the resource monitor application of the Synology, for example. You could also implement logging and alerting with log center packages. We're going to log the system activity, the user logins, the file access and activities, because usually you can have all this information in the log center. You should also syslog your logs, so you can transfer the logs to a SIEM with log center. And why? Because the log center is very limited. So if you put it in an external system, it will allow you to preserve the logs if you get attacked, because usually it's going to try to delete the logs. And you can also create some additional and conditional alerts, with scripting or using a SIEM, for example. So this is very practical because you can say that, for example, this user accessing those kind of folders at this time of day, for example, it's not normal. So you can have a lot of scenarios that you can implement with and that you can be alerted by using some scripting or SIEM. You should also use the security advisor for login analysis, which is a new feature of maybe, I don't know, 6 months ago, which allows you to see that, for example, a user suddenly connected to the NAS from an IP which is different, or a device that is different, for example. It's also able to scan for malicious programs, abnormal tasks, malicious system configuration, task scripts, and abnormal users. So this, I don't know how it really works because I never encountered any problem on my side, so I don't know how it will react. It will probably just detect and alert you. And you can also use the antivirus of the NAS, which can help in some cases, especially if it's in a multi-staged attack. So if it's someone compromising your system, putting some malicious script or malicious files, but it's not yet the ransomware, because this is just a piece of malware that is waiting to the command of the hacker. Well, it's not hacking. Your system is compromised. You have a piece of malware waiting for a command, so it's not encrypting your files yet, but probably the antivirus could be able to see that there is something malicious and delete the file. But of course, the antivirus is extremely limited. You could also create some canary files, and you could be alerted in case of this file being accessed or changed. But this, you need scripting, because this is not something that you can find on a NAS, or not on Synology NAS. Okay, so now we're going to talk about impact limitation and propagation. So we know that our NAS has been compromised, and the ransomware is encrypting our data. So this is going to affect the local folders of our NAS, but it can also affect remote folders if you have, because on the NAS you can create some SMB shares that are on another system, or FTP, SFTP, or I don't exactly remember all the list. Also some Dropbox and everything. So it's going to affect local folders and remote folders. Now, there is not a lot of things that you can do on this Synology to protect yourself from a ransomware. It's more going to be prevention, like the other video. So you can limit the impact by implementing the least privilege principle in terms of users and groups permissions on folders. Okay, so if a user or a group, they don't need to access a folder on the NAS, just don't give them the right. So if a ransomware is compromised, or an account is compromised, it will stay local to this folder, unless the ransomware can exploit some vulnerability and have some vertical privilege attack. You should also apply the prevention measures of the other video on other systems to protect them. So this will limit the propagation from the compromised NAS to other systems. So we're going to limit the lateral movement. Now, if the NAS is a central mount point of other systems hosting data, they will also be at risk. Okay, so your NAS is connected, as I said before, to a WebDAV FTP, SFTP sites, Dropbox, Google Drive, and some other backup systems, like another hyper backup NAS, or even your local hyper backup system. Well, they're going to be encrypted too. And if an administrator account is compromised, well, it's game over. Probably all your data is going to be encrypted. Now, in terms of automated response, okay, so you put in place before the monitoring, the detection, and the alerting. But the ransomware are too fast for humans to respond. If a user is going to tell you, oh, there is something strange going on, if you see on your dashboard that yes, the activity is maybe is not normal, it's probably too late anyway. A ransomware can go extremely fast, especially if your NAS has a good performance. So you need to use all the detection tools that you created before and add an automated response if possible. So for example, if someone is scanning your ports, you block its IP. If you've got too many failed login attempts on your NAS, block the IP and block the user. If a user is accessing or modifying too many files or the canary file, for example, you could deactivate the account. If a strange file names or extensions are present on the system, shut down the NAS, for example. And well, the canary, I already said it, you can block the user or shut down NAS. That depends on what you are ready to do and what could impact the business. If you're a home user anyway, you don't care about your business, you just turn it off in order to avoid the ransomware encrypting too many files. Now for the backup and recovery. So ransomwares may destroy all the backups first before it's going to encrypt the files. So where are going to back up your data? Okay, so you will have anyway some on-site backups and local snapshots on the same NAS, or for the backup on a USB hard drive, for example. This hard drive is going to be always connected on the NAS because you would like to have, regular backups going on. But if the ransomware is going to attack your NAS, it's going to attack your backup, so you will lose your backup. You could also have some hard disk that you will manually connect every time you're going to do a backup, and when the backup is down, you can auto eject the drive. With hyper backup you can do that, and then you can put this hard disk in another place, for example. Now for the offsite backups and snapshot replication, so with hyper backup and the snapshot packages, as usual, you can have another NAS in another place, and you're going to have also your data that are going to be backed up on this other NAS, and probably this NAS is also going to be backed up with a hard disk, for example. And as usual, it's all the same thing, it's going to be always connected either by the network, for example, or either by the USB hard disk. So if the ransomware is going to encrypt your first NAS, it can go and encrypt your other NAS or the backups on the other NAS. That depends on your architecture. And as usual, you can have also on the offsite backup, if it's done on another NAS with a USB hard disk, you could disconnect the drive, or having another person disconnecting the drive after. You can always use the auto eject function, so you know that although it's still connected, a ransomware will not be able to directly attack this drive. Now for cloud backups, it's usually always connected, so you can have permanent backups going on, but you cannot really go offline with the cloud backups. But what you can do is put a firewall rule that will only allow, for example, the backups going from a certain time to a certain time, and then the rule is going to block the traffic right after. So you can have two clouds, one on Dropbox, for example, which is always connected, one on Google Drive, which will be connected and disconnected through a firewall rule. Now for the backup and recovery again, so you have to regularly verify your backup and snapshot logs, and you can create some alerts for that, at least for the backups. For the snapshots, I'm not really sure. Always verify that the log is not giving you any kind of error for the backup. Also regularly verify the backup integrity, you have a quick integrity check and a long integrity check. Just do them often so you are sure that the data should be recoverable in case of problem. But you also have to regularly test your procedure, and you have to do a real recovery on as per system, because sometimes all the test, the backup logs are okay, the integrity check is okay, but when you are going to recover your data, you see that something is not working right. Some data is missing, the archive probably just got corrupted, you never know. And you could also use the file versioning with Synology Drive, so you can recover your files also quite fast in case of problem, and you can go in time. So you've got three technologies: you've got the backup, you've got the snapshots, and you've got Synology, and you've got file versioning with Drive. Okay, so this was the last slide. It may be a lot of content. Probably I was not thorough in some of the slides because there is a lot to talk about, or it's a completely separate subject. But anyway, if you got any questions, well, feel free to ask in the comments. And if you like the video, just press the like button and subscribe. Thank you guys for your attention. Goodbye.